The 61st session of the Senate in the second regular session of
family and friends, and for the trials that strengthen us each time. With all humility, we ask your divine mercy to forgive us in all our wrongdoings. Free our hearts of hatred, our souls of doubts, and our minds of misgivings, and lead us to the path of righteousness as we perform our task, always flaws. Enlighten us, dear Lord, and strengthen our faith in your higher purpose, and open our mind to the truth that everything is unfolding according to your divine plan. We humbly ask you to help us be compassionate, just like you, slow to anger, and abounding in love. This we ask in Jesus' name, our Amen.
Call the roll.
Roll call of members. The Honorable Senator Sangara Aquino.
Amen. The Secretary roll.
Roll call of members. The Honorable Senator Sangara Aquino, Binay, Cayetano Alan, Ejercito, Enrique Osel.
The Chair declares the presence of a quorum. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, with the consent of the Senate, I move that we dispense with the reading of the Journal of the 60th Session, March 3, 2015, and consider the same as approved.
Any objection? Hearing none. The reading of the Journal of Session number 60 is dispensed with, and the same is hereby approved.
Mr. President, before we go to the reference of business, I would like to acknowledge, or if the body could please acknowledge, the following individuals and groups. Firstly, the participants of the 13th International Festival of Language and Culture.
The National Festival of Language and Culture is hereby acknowledged. Welcome to the Senate.
Mr. President, Congressman Kyung Chum Lee of University, Ifugao State University, headed by Ms. Jamaica Bumin.
The students of State University are welcome to the Senate, and Mr. Manuel Malingan. Welcome to the Senate, yes.
Mr. Lim of
San Narciso, Zambales, with Barangay Captain Ving, made of record, and you're welcome to the
Mr. President, Congressman O'Neil Roque of the 4th District of Bukidnon, with the ABCs of Valencia Bukidnon, led by ABC President Arlando, with the ABCs of Valencia Bukidnon, led by ABC President Arlando Cañete, are also here.
We welcome the House of...
Finally, Mr. President, we would like to acknowledge indigenous peoples of Mindanao, Ms. Leonora Mokudef, Ms. Leticia Datuata, Ms. Genevieve Cornel, Mr. Julieto Gandor, Mr. Roldan Babelon, Ms. Beatriz Colmo, Ms. Sani Bello, Ms. Lucy Rico, Ms. also here with us, Mr. President.
We welcome of record, and we welcome them to the Senate.
Mr. President, now I move that we proceed with the reference of business.
Read the reference of business.
Bills on first reading. Senate Bill number 2677, entitled An Act to Eradicate Mobile Phone Aided Registration of all prepaid SIM cards for seniors. 26 guards at all public swimming pools and bathing facilities, and providing Pen 1205, resolution expressing the full support and active participation of the Senate of the Philippines in the observance of the International Women's Day by Senator Lapi. Resolution number 1205, resolution expressing the full support and active participation of the Senate of the Philippines in the observance, directing the Committee on Agriculture and Food, Health and Demography and Appropriations to conduct an inquiry and aid of legislation, Philippine government, in light of the outbreak of a new strain of bird flu. Senate Committee on the report to the Philippine Institute for Volcanology and Seismology that a magnitude 8 earthquake may hit Bicol region. Senator Defensor Santiago.
National Defense and Security, Local Government.
Bicol region. Senator Defensor Santiago.
National Defense and Security.
1208, resolution directing
and Demography, Women, Family Relations, Gender Equality.
The recent Commission audit report that the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources account for 237.5, directing the proper Santiago.
Agriculture and Food.
1210, directing the proper Senate Committee to conduct an inquiry in 8 billion pesos. It received 13 cents, died without receiving the blood transfusions they needed because they failed to pay laboratory fees immediately. Syndrome coronavirus, MERS-CoV in the Philippines are increasing by Senator Defensor Santiago.
Health and Demography.
1212, directing the proper Senate committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the report that the shift to costlier fuels has raised power rates in Mindanao by Senator Defensor Santiago.
Energy, Public Services.
1213, directing the proper Senate committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on reported complaints against Philippine Airlines on DC by Senator Defensor Santiago.
Foreign Service and Government Reorganization.
1214, directing the proper Senate committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the report that the gig fishermen are opposing an expressway dike planned by the Department of Public Works and Highways by Senator Defensor Santiago.
Public Works and Local Governments.
1215, directing the proper Senate committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the report that 75% of Filipino cancer victims die with excruciating pain by Senator Defensor Santiago.
Health and Demography.
1216, directing the proper Senate committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the reported shortage of radiologists by Senator Defensor Santiago.
Health and Demography.
And PS Resolution number 1217, resolution directing the proper Senate committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the report that dolphins were killed due to dynamite fishing in Pangasinan and La Union by Senator Defensor Santiago.
Agriculture and Food.
109. 109.
Recess.
Mr. President, ready to resume.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, I withdraw the motion regarding the committee report number 109 and upon the request of Senator Po to have a caucus.
Session is suspended. Session is suspended. Session is resumed. Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that we transfer Senate Bill number 2235 under Committee Report number 109 from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders.
So transferred.
With the consent of the Senate, I move that we consider Senate Bill number 2235 under Committee Report number 109.
Any objection? Hearing none.
With the permission of the body, Mr. President, I move that the Secretary read only the title of the measure.
Secretary will do so.
Senate Bill number 2235, an act amending sections 443, 454, 463, and 477 of Republic Act number 7160, otherwise known as the Local Government Code of 1991, and for other purposes.
Mr. President, I move that we recognize Senator Marcos to sponsor the measure.
Senator Marcos is recognized to sponsor the measure.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon. I take the floor today to report out the findings of the Committee on Local Government as embodied in Committee Report number 109, taking into consideration Senate Bill number 2235, which seeks to mandate the creation of the separate office of a local building official in cities and first and second class municipalities by amending sections 443, 454, and 477 of Republic Act number 7160 or the Local Government Code of 1991. The local engineer is one of the officials whose appointment is mandated by the Local Government Code in provinces, cities, municipalities. Under the code, one of the responsibilities entrusted with the local engineer is to, quote, exercise such other powers and perform such other duties and functions as may be prescribed by law or ordinance, close quote. And one such law that prescribes duties and functions is the National Building Code of the Philippines, Presidential Decree number 1096. Enacted in 1977, the National Building Code was meant to provide for all buildings and structures a framework of minimum standards and requirements to regulate and control their location, site, design, quality of materials, construction, use, occupancy, and maintenance, with a view to building and maintaining them in safe, sanitary, and good working condition. Under the National Building Code, the enforcement and implementation of its provisions were vested upon the Department of Public Works and Highways through the building officials. However, it was the city and municipal engineers who were made to act as the default building officials within their respective territorial jurisdictions. Although appointees of the local chief executives, these building officials were expressly mandated to fall under the administrative supervision of the Department of Public Works and Highways for their special designation or acting capacity under the Building Code. Section 205 of the National Building Code further provided that the designation shall continue until regular positions of building officials are provided or unless sooner terminated for causes provided by law or decree. Then in 1991, Republic Act number 7160 was enacted, thus statutorily confirming with finality what used to be a mere temporary designation of the local engineer as a concurrent building official. Hence, Section 477 of the Local Government Code stated, the appointment of an engineer shall be mandatory for the provincial, city, and municipal governments. The city and municipal engineer shall also act as the local building official. This is Section 477, RA number 7160. For almost 25 years since the enactment of the Local Government Code, local engineers have juggled dual roles, acting as concurrent building officials in their respective areas as mandated by the National Building Code. But juggling such manifold roles by a singular official proved to be no mean feat. The duties of the local engineer outlined in the Local Government Code are already immense as they are. The additional duties imposed by the National Building Code can be too overbearing for local engineers constrained by manpower and resources. As chairman of the Senate Committee on Public Works, this representation has heard bills and conducted inquiries in aid of legislation on various issues, from the need to amend our building code, which is of 1977 vintage, to the disaster resiliency of our buildings and structures, to the so-called practice of green building, even stretching to extremes, like proposals to impose the penalty of reclusion perpetua upon erring and neglectful local building officials. All these put in the spotlight not only the implementation of the National Building Code, but more importantly, the inadequacy in its enforcement and the weakness in the regulatory framework. Well-meaning local engineers, building officials have come forward in various public hearings of the Senate Committee on Public Works, both admitting and lamenting the fact that they could not possibly comply with all the duties and responsibilities of their dual positions without difficulty. In fact, several of our city and municipal governments have addressed such an overbearing situation by creating through ordinance a separate office of the local building official. Based on the data provided by the DPWH, an overwhelming majority of our cities and municipalities have made do with their local engineers acting as local building officials. Among the notable exceptions are the 17 in Aklan, 14 in Pangasinan, 10 in Cebu, and 10 in the Metro Manila LGUs, which have created an office of the local building official separate from the office of the local engineer. The Committee on Local Government is of the firm and considered opinion that Congress should strengthen the regulatory framework and address the organizational inefficiencies of the local government unit caused by the dual roles being played by the local engineer, for this impacts in our ability to enforce several existing laws and regulations and referral codes, such as but not limited to the Architectural Code, Philippine Electrical Code, Revised Plumbing Code, Structural Code, Mechanical Engineering Code, as well as future ones like green building laws. Moreover, this is all the more made urgent by considering the confluence of several factors that are being faced by the communities now. First and foremost is the rapid urbanization of our communities. The Philippine Statistics Authority notes a 21% increase in approved building permits in 2014, with total construction value increasing by 100% more than the previous year. And these are just the recorded data based on the approved building permits in the country, and we too must accept the sad fact that several constructions are being undertaken all over the country without even bothering to apply for building permits at all. Second, it has been observed that the present construction boom in our country is due not only to the sustained growth of our tourism and business, high OFW remittances, and other indicators of economic progress, but also to our government's own drive to reconstruct typhoon-ravaged homes and address the housing backlog. Second, our communities are faced with more frequent and worsening disasters, both man-made and those caused by natural hazards, most notably storms and earthquakes. Especially now that our country has been attuned to the present global standard of care of disaster risk reduction and management, emphasize the need for more resilient buildings and the battle cry of build back better in case of destruction wrought by disasters. All these responsibilities, ensuring disaster preparedness and mitigation, disaster proofing of our homes and buildings, determination of what building better, etc., fall upon our local government units. In fact, let us remember that the Department of Interior and Local Government is the vice chairperson for disaster preparedness under the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010, or RA 10121. Therefore, Congress should strengthen the regulatory framework within our local government units and create a separate office of the local building official in cities and municipalities in order to justly distribute and transfer to an equally qualified professional the equally important responsibilities required of the local engineer under the National Building Code, including site inspections, examination and approval of plans and permits. Indeed, according to the Local Government Code, the state should ensure that there shall be more responsive and accountable local government structure and accountable, efficient, and dynamic organizational structure and operating mechanisms that will meet the priority needs and service requirements of its communities. We can definitely be assured that this improvement of the regulatory framework in our local government units shall lay the foundation for further and corollary improvement in our building laws and rules, as well as in their enforcement. As to financial resources, the local building officials are authorized to collect fees and charges in line with their enforcement and regulatory powers under the National Building Code, which shall accrue to the fund of the local government units concerned. These powers and provisions in the National Building Code have been replicated and embedded into our draft bill being submitted at this august chamber. Please allow me to end by recalling the collapse of Ruby Tower in 1968, the burning of Ozone Disco in 1996. Both these tragic and deplorable events, which claimed the lives of many members of our community, involved ill-fated structures and traced their roots to neglectful enforcement of our building laws. In the November 2014 decision of the Sandigan Bayan, which convicted several persons, including local engineers and local building officials, it was mentioned that the ozone disco incident could have been prevented had it not been for the, I quote, slapdash approval of the building permits and certificates of occupancy and the lackadaisical screening of the paper requirements, close quote. Let us strengthen and capacitate our local government units by giving them the necessary manpower and competence, aided by adequate financial resources to afford them a fair means and opportunity to strictly comply with the mandate of our building laws and regulation. This is in order to prevent the needless loss of lives and properties in the future owing to the dangers posed by unmonitored and unregulated, weak, substandard, and disaster-prone buildings and structures. I highly urge our colleagues in this chamber and in Congress to support the passage of this bill. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you, Senator Marcos. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that we suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 2235 under Committee Report number 109.
So suspended.
Mr. President, I move that we change the referral of Senate Bill number 490. This is the One Philippines Act of 2013 from the Committee on Public Services to the Committee on Science and Technology.
Any objection? Is that consistent with the rule on jurisdiction of the committees, Mr. Majority Leader?
Yes, Mr. President. This is on ICT, actually.
All right. Approved.
Mr. President, with the consent of the Senate, I move that we resume consideration of Senate Bill number 2669 under Committee Report number 104. This is the Tax Incentives Management and Transparency Bill.
Resumption of consideration of the measure is in order.
Mr. President, the parliamentary status is that we are in the period of interpellations, so I move that you recognize the sponsor, Senator Sani Angara.
Senator Angara is recognized.
Mr. President, there have been no senators who signify that they want to interpolate, so I move that we...
No.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
I move that we recognize Senator Soto for interpellation, Mr. President.
Senator Soto is recognized.
Mr. President, may I have a 1 minute suspension.
1 minute suspension. Clear? Clear?
Mr. President, ready to resume.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, we're in the period of interpellation and the minority floor leader, may we move to recognize the minority floor leader for some questions? Thank you.
The minority leader is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to the acting majority leader. Will the distinguished sponsor, son of one of my idols, answer some clarifications or questions for my clarification?
With pleasure. It would be an honor, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, allow me to place on record that because this bill was sponsored and co-sponsored by Senator Recto and Senator Angara, you know, when Senator Recto sponsors a bill, I have a tendency to agree. But this is for my education. That's why I've tried to understand the bill that is being proposed, Senate Bill 2669. So, with that, Mr. President, under Section 4, monitoring of tax incentives, I quote, "The amounts pertaining to tax incentives administered by investment promotion agencies, IPAs, and other government agencies, OGAs, to registered business entities and qualified private individuals or corporations, as the case may be, shall be clearly specified in accordance with the schedule prepared by the Department of Finance, the DOF." How is the schedule defined, Mr. President?
Documentation.
May, yes. Let me stop there. How do you define schedule, Mr. President?
Well, Mr. President, there is no format right now, but the idea is really that the DOF will specify what information is to be given regarding the tax incentives granted to the registered enterprises. But in no way should this be interpreted to mean that there is a limitation on the incentives to be granted to qualified individuals, corporations, registered enterprises. I think that's the fear of some of the IPAs, and we are actually crafting language to make it more precise, so as not to give the impression that the DOF, by creating a schedule, has the power to limit the grant of incentives, Mr. President.
If I may, basically it is documentation for reportorial requirement.
That's precisely the point, Mr. President.
Thank you.
So, in the so-called schedule, what will be the coverage and scope of the information to be provided in the schedule?
Well, it would include things that are already included in submissions to the BOI, for example, Mr. President, things like fees paid, employees. So the intent there is really to get a fuller picture of the operation of these enterprises which enjoy incentives, so as to going forward to be able to adequately weigh the benefits to the country.
So, again, prepared by the Department of Finance, when you say DOF, how will they prepare the schedule, Mr. President? How will DOF prepare it?
Well, under the implementing rules, they will consult with the DTI, the BOI, the
What
PEZA.
implementing rules are you pertaining to, Mr. President?
The implementing rules which will be created pursuant to this law, Mr. President.
To this law. Yeah, sometimes I have difficulty with IRRs, Mr. President. I wish we could include that already in the bill, so that we are no longer subject to the interpretations of the executive department. There are times that it has happened in the past. Lately, remember what happened to the issue on drug testing in the DOTC. They wanted their own in IRR. They wanted their own interpretation. So, do you think we can spread it out in the, even if you do not want to incorporate it completely in the bill, we can probably place it on record in the Senate deliberations so that it is clear on how this will be prepared.
Well, if I may, with the indulgence of the good minority leader, Mr. President, read the proposed draft, which we will read as a committee amendment. In Section 4, tax incentives administered by IPAs to registered business entities shall be clearly specified in accordance with the reportorial requirements prepared by the DOF, which shall include information such as but not limited to project profile, employment, investments made, and taxes, licenses, and fees paid. So there's an effort to mention with greater specificity the information.
So
and
that will be part of your committee amendments?
Yes, Your
right.
Honor.
Now, how similar or how different is this? The information that will be reflected in the schedule compared to the information required in the tax incentives information, TII, provided in your next section, Section 5. Halos ano ba ito?
Well, the tax incentives information, Mr. President, is what will be seen by the public in the as appended to the budget document in the BESF. And what will be put there is not information pertaining to each corporation or registered entity, but it is an aggregate because the point was raised during the hearings that we don't want to reveal too much to our competitors in terms of how much incentives we grant. But in the aggregate, it will be there how much we grant as incentives, and that can be weighed against the other social benefits such as employment generated, other fees and taxes paid to other agencies of the government, Mr. President.
All right. In that case, let me go to Section 5, tax incentive information. Who shall give the tax incentive data to be included in the tax incentive information, again, Mr. President, such as actual claims, estimate claims, etc.?
Mr. President, there are different levels of submissions and reportorial requirements. First of all, at the level of the enterprises or those enjoying the incentives, they must file an annual report with the IPAs or the investment promotion agencies. And in turn, the IPAs will aggregate this data and submit also their own reports to the Department of Finance.
All right. Thank you, Mr. President. Now, going forward, Section 6, administration, implementation, reporting, and tracking of tax incentives. These reports, including the type and amount of tax incentives administered, shall be consolidated and reflected in the TII report to be submitted to the DOF by the IPAs or OGAs within 6 months from the deadline of filing of tax returns. Okay. What is the amount of tax incentives administered, Mr. President?
That is the amount of tax incentives given, Mr. President. So it would be an aggregate of all the tax holidays and tax credits, all added together, Mr. President. Yeah, customs duties.
So the IPAs will compute the tax
they will aggregate
themselves
the what is given to them by the different registered enterprises and also what is in their books as to what they have granted in terms of tax incentives, Mr. President.
What about the BIR? Will they be computing the incentives also, Mr. President?
Well, the BIR will be subject of the tax incentives tracking program. There will be information sharing among the different agencies, Mr. President. I think the purpose...
Go ahead, sir.
The purpose there really is that going forward, we can see how these enterprises tend to game the system. Maybe they move from IPA to IPA, and they don't pay taxes in the regular course of business. So things like that, I think we want to make sure that we can tighten up the revenue system, Mr. President.
You mentioned the tax incentives tracking program. Let me continue with your Section 6. The DOF, together with the BIR and the BOC, shall create a tax incentives tracking program of all tax incentives administered by the IPAs and OGAs, monitor the incentives granted, and submit an annual TII report to the President and to the chairpersons of the Committees on Finance and the Appropriations of the Senate and the House of Representatives, respectively, as part of the annual BESF. Copy furnished the chairpersons of the Committees on Ways and Means of both Houses of Congress and the chairpersons of the Committees on Trade and Commerce of the Senate and chairperson of the Committee on Trade, Commerce, and Entrepreneurship of the House of Representatives. May we be educated on the reason for the DOF to create a tax incentives tracking program, Mr. President?
Well, really, the purpose is with full disclosure, Mr. President. We can better adjudge the wisdom of the laws, the various laws. Congress has enacted over 100 laws which give incentives to various sectors and given powers to various IPAs to grant incentives. And I guess looking forward, it is to help the submissions to the President and to Congress are to sort of to look at on a macro level the benefits and costs of giving such incentives. To the President, because the President appoints people to the BOI, which is one of the largest incentive granting bodies, and to Congress, because Congress has delegated the power to grant tax incentives to various bodies which were created by legislative fiat, Mr. President.
Well, there is a perspective that wouldn't it be more appropriate for NEDA or the PSA to be the one to create the tax incentives tracking program? Because the DOF, the BIR, the BOC, as you mentioned, they can be recipients of the information and they can use it in performing their mandates, respective mandates.
That is certainly been a topic of debate, Mr. President, a good minority leader, and I think that is the point of view espoused by the BOI and the DTI, because they feel that they and the DOF are at opposite ends of the spectrum with respect to the grant of incentives, where the BOI wants to give as many incentives as it can, whereas the DOF, if they had their way, would not give any incentives. So I can understand where they're coming from in wanting to have a neutral arbiter in the person of the NEDA or the PSA. But I suppose there is a need to have the DOF in the loop of information, because right now the DOF claims that they really cannot see the universe of incentives. That's why they're asking for this measure, because talagang hindi nila makita yung yung kabuuan ng mga binibigay na incentives.
So will they be the repository of the data, of all this data?
Well, we've tried to come up with
DOF yan.
We've tried to come up with a compromise, Mr. President, where the DOF is the repository, but copy furnished the NEDA and the PSA. PSA is under the NEDA. So
okay. Is it found in the bill, Mr. President?
Not yet. It's in our committee amendments because we met with the DTI yesterday for the information of the good minority leader.
All right, very good. When do you plan to submit your committee amendments, Mr. President? Because we want to look at how the bill will shape up after you...
Well, I think we are Monday. Ready na.
Because I understand the Senate President is interpolating also, so perhaps we may be given a chance to look over the bill after the committee amendments already are presented.
Well, we're actually ready with it today, Mr. President. So, depending on how interpellations go.
Okay. In the meantime, I will terminate my interpellations, Mr. President, and thank the distinguished gentleman for answering my questions.
I thank the good minority leader, Mr. President.
Thank you, Minority Leader. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, the Senate President would like to take the floor for interpellations as well.
The Senate President is recognized.
Thank you, sir. Will the gentleman sponsor yield a few questions?
Again,
Just
it would be an
spread-
honor to yield to one of the authors of the measure and the leader of the chamber, Mr.
Yes,
President.
yes. And these questions are only designed to spread into the record certain issues that can support the measure. So, with that, Mr. President, let me first congratulate the good sponsor for giving priority to this important measure, which is basically to gather information. And I am glad that the sponsor made it very clear that there is no intention to withdraw any of the incentives granted, nor to limit the power of the investment promotion bodies in accordance with the powers granted them by law or their charter. But so having said that, Mr. President, we allow us to spread into the record. First, how many investment promotion agencies right now do we have?
Well, right now we have, under the definition of terms, Section 3A, there is a wide definition of what an investment promotion agency is, but the definition includes 14 agencies of governments: the BOI, the Board of Investments; secondly, the PEZA, the Philippine Economic Zone Authority; the third is the Basis Conversion Development Authority; the fourth is Subic Bay Metropolitan Authority; fourth is Clark Development Corporation, CDC; fifth is John Hay Management Corporation; sixth is Poro Point Management Corporation; seventh is Bataan Technology Park; eighth is Cagayan Economic Zone Authority; ninth is Zamboanga City Special Economic Zone Authority; 10th is Fividec Industrial Authority; 11th is the Aurora Pacific Economic Zone and Freeport Authority; 13th is the Authority of the Freeport Area of Bataan; and 14th is the TIEZA, or the Tourism Infrastructure and Enterprise Zone Authority.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Mr. President. And the incentives usually granted are generally income tax holidays.
Income tax holidays, there is gross income in lieu of regular corporate taxation. There are exemptions for research and development costs, importation,
duties?
customs duties. Yes, these are usually standard incentives granted, Mr. President.
Mr. President, the 2015 budget of expenditures and sources of funds, or what we call as the BESF, enumerates the investment tax expenditures per promotion agency in 2012. Did the sponsor be aware of that?
That's right. I think we are looking at the same document, Mr. President, and there is a total of 159,885,000.
No.
159 billion rather. I correct myself. 159 billion 885 million 418 thousand pesos
So, all right,
of
just-
actual tax expenditures.
Right. So the actual tax exemption amounted to in 2012, 159 billion 885 million 418,000 pesos per record of the per public record as enumerated in the BESF.
That's right, Mr. President. That's the source there listed is the BIR, the Bureau of Customs, and the Department of Finance. But with the caveat that these figures are gathered from electronic filings. So
Electronic filing. In other words, those which are not filed electronically are not captured here.
That's correct, Mr. President. So in that sense, it would not capture the whole universe
That's
of
correct.
incentives granted.
In fact, our information is that this number of 159.8 billion would be accounted only by 29% of the registered locators who filed electronically their income tax returns. Is that correct?
It is 47% according to the Department of Finance.
For
2012, Mr. President.
For 2012, 47% of the locators would account for 159.88 billion pesos. Is that correct?
That's right, Mr. President.
And therefore, it is appropriate to have a more accurate picture that we should mandate that all filings should be there should be an electronic filing so that we can capture all the data.
Well,
just for information.
I think that would be a good system if the electronic filing for taxes would be followed, and so as to capture the true extent of incentives granted. And coupled with what we want to achieve here in the bill, it would make for a more well-rounded system, more comprehensive system, Mr. President.
Very good. So at the appropriate time, we can introduce that as an amendment.
Yes, Mr. President.
Now, of course, by the way, are housing developers given incentives?
I think at certain points they are included in the BOI list of those given incentives. Low-cost housing.
Socialized housing.
Socialized housing, yes.
And socialized housing is defined as
I think
houses
2 to 3 million, if I'm not mistaken.
3 million, if I recall.
Below
right.
and below, yes.
And that's considered as socialized housing.
Yes, Mr. President.
So a condominium unit costing 3 million would not pay taxes.
Wala. None, Mr. President. Yeah.
Is that fair, Your Honor?
Well, that the fairness of the measure under review, Mr. President, does not really pass on the fairness of the incentives. We've left that to the mother measure, which is the rationalization of fiscal incentives. But well, I guess the purpose of that law was really to incentivize the construction of housing for lower income earners.
That's right.
So we would need more information to actually to pass judgment on the fairness of such an incentive.
Well, all right. When we grant incentives, we assume that when we grant the incentive, there's something that is returned to the public in the form of more employment, in the form of maybe more export receipts, etc. Would the sponsor agree with that?
Certainly, Mr. President, that is the primary rationale for incentives. I think not just in the Philippines but all over the world, and that's one of the goals of the measure, is really to quantify these social benefits. I think the good presiding officer, the Senate President Pro Tempore, Senator Recto, mentioned in his sponsorship speech that we have to give credit to those investors who venture beyond the urban locales into the rural areas. Being a developing country, not many businessmen want to go to the poorer provinces. So we must put a premium on this type of investment where employment is created in the local communities, and in a sense we decongest Metro Manila and the various urban communities.
But certainly the condominiums in Manila, which we see sprouting all over the place, would not fall under that kind of incentive.
Well, we would have to review. Sometimes incentives can have perverse effects, and again, as I said earlier, Mr. President, I would not want to pass judgment on particular incentives without seeing the totality of the effects, because not knowing how many jobs were created by these incentives, not knowing how many communities were developed, I would hesitate to pass judgment, Mr. President.
Okay. I fully concur with that. We need information. But would the bill in its present form require that kind of information?
Which kind, Mr. President?
I mean, for example,
yeah.
The number of employment generated as a result of the incentive granted.
It would, Mr. President, both at an enterprise level, meaning within particular companies, but also at the more macro level, at the industry level.
And also at the level...
and also at the level of the investment promotion agency level. So at various levels, we will have more complete information.
That's right. But what is in the BSF is just the aggregate amount of incentives granted by the investment promotion agencies.
Yes, but we will have those submissions, and they will be available to senators who wish to see them with
But
the DOF.
can we include that in the BSF as an annex or something? So that we will know, the public will know, who are these companies who enjoy the incentives, how much, and
Well, we can study that proposal, Mr. President, but as envisioned now, what is envisioned is the macro figures.
Yes.
But we were worried about the maybe these might be voluminous in terms of if we do it per enterprise, but perhaps per industry would be possible.
well, because you mentioned in the course of your response to the minority leader that you said that there is resistance to this information because the locators, for example, or those who enjoy this incentive would not want their competitors to know the incentives they get. I don't understand it. If we are, looking at transparency, this kind of rationale would certainly not sit well. Why would they not? These are the incentives that they get, so that instead of merely aggregating the incentives granted by the investment promotion agency, we should also make public the recipients, the beneficiaries.
I agree fully, Mr. President. Let me clarify my earlier statement. What I said was based on a statement made during the hearings by the representative of the Board of Investments, who was a member of the board, saying that they did not want to reveal what they had granted because the competitors would see it. And they were pushing for a confidentiality clause on the per industry and the per enterprise data, which we did not accept.
Good. So that the sponsor will be amenable to an amendment which would require that the beneficiaries of these incentives should be made public also.
I totally agree. I think it should be open to academic scrutiny, for example, Mr. President, for economists to see whether these are what they would call superfluous or redundant incentives going forward, whether these incentives were granted to companies who have no choice because they operate in the Philippine market. So even without the incentives, they would have invested the money anyway. So I think these are important considerations in making policy, Mr. President.
Yeah. But just to spread into the record, the schedule in the 2015 BSF, as we earlier mentioned, the total tax expenditure by virtue of the incentives granted by the IPAs or investment promotion agencies would amount to 159.8 billion, which is only 47% of the registered locators. But just for the record, that the report in the BSF would show that the Philippine Economic Zone Authority had granted the most number or the highest incentive expenditure amounting to 129.1 billion. Then comes the Board of Investments at 24.2 billion, the Subic Bay Export Zone at 3.8 billion, the Clark Freeport Zone at 2.1 billion, and the others, the other IPAs would also be enumerated there. So here we're looking at, according to the Senate President Pro Tempore, Senator Recto, we're talking of at least 200 billion pesos a year in terms of the tax expenditure as a consequence of the incentives granted. Would the good sponsor confirm that those
I
data?
did hear that figure thrown around by Secretary Purisme in one of his speeches, and I do confirm the figures cited by the good Senate President in his interpellations. And the PEZA really is the biggest grantor of incentives, but at the same time, it's also the biggest generator of employment.
Yes.
And according to the DOF, they're also the most transparent in terms of disclosing what incentives and to whom such incentives were granted.
Very good, yes. In fact, we're not saying that it's bad. What we're just saying is let's see and let's inform everyone of what these incentives are, how much, and what do we get in return, so that yes, PESA may have the highest in terms of tax expenditure because of the incentive, but maybe they also generate the highest employment, the most number of employment. So this is in fact a good start, because then we'll have better data to determine future policy. We know that there is so much resistance on the proposed rationalization of fiscal incentive, but this is a good start wherein we expose what the real picture is before we proceed with the debate on that law.
I couldn't agree more, Mr. President.
With that, Mr. President, I have no longer any questions on the sponsor, and we thank the sponsor for accommodating us and spreading to the record what we have, the items that we have to spread. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Senate
just one
President.
question from the chair.
Yes, certainly.
If the
certainly.
Sponsor will allow.
Certainly from the author also of the
Yes.
measure.
Now, because I'm just looking at the data, and it says here PESA granted the most number in 2012, roughly a little less than 130 billion. Are most of these export-oriented enterprises?
No, yung BOI, hindi. Are you just asking about the PESA?
Just the PESA.
The PESA, yes.
The PESA would be mostly.
mostly
But would there
export.
be registered enterprises in PESA that are not export-oriented? Or that does not earn foreign exchange?
Yes or no? Tanong, yes or no? I have been told that there are some, which are service-oriented, Mr. President.
Okay. And then the Board of Investment, these are not earning foreign exchange.
They're
They're not export-oriented.
not.
They're domestic
Not,
enterprises.
it's a mix. Usually, the BOI incentives are usually a mix.
Yeah, but chances
historically.
are more domestic.
Quite a few are limited to the Philippine market.
Okay, thank you
Mr.
very much.
President.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. What do you want? You want me to do it already?
A minute suspension, Mr. President.
Minute suspended. Session suspended.
Ready to resume.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, we have a reservation from Senator Villar to interpolate on Monday. Therefore, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 2669 under Committee Report number 104.
The measure is suspended for the meantime.
Thank you. A minute suspension.
1 minute suspension. Alin dito?
Ready to resume.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, I move that we proceed with the additional reference of business.
So moved. So ordered.
Additional reference to Business Committee Report, Committee Report number 110, prepared and submitted jointly by the Committees on Education, Arts and Culture, Social Justice, Welfare and Rural Development, Ways and Means, Youth, Women, Family Relations, and Gender Equality and Finance on Senate Bill number 2679 with Senators Ligarda, Escudero, Sonny Angara, Recto, Ramon Bong Revilla Jr., Cynthia A. Villar, Ejercito Estrada, Trillanes D. Fort, Joseph Victor Ejercito, Defensor Santiago Paulo Benignong Bam Aquino IV, and Cayetano P. as others thereof entitled, an act providing for a comprehensive and unified student financial assistance system for tertiary education, UNIFAST, thereby rationalizing access thereto, appropriating funds therefore and for other purposes, recommending its approval in substitution of Senate Bill numbers 658, 270, 283, 298, 508, 511, 563, 637, 662, 827, 862, 1319, 1458, 1475, 1613, 1776, 1960, 1976, 2025, 2510, and PS Resolution number 388, taking into consideration House Bill number 4591, its sponsor, Senator Cayetano Kia.
I move that we transfer Senate Bill number 2679 under Committee Report number 110 from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders.
Is there any objection? There being none, the motion is approved. Consideration of Senate Bill number 2679 under Committee Report number 110 is now in order.
With the permission of the body, I move that the Secretary read only the title of the measure.
An act providing for a comprehensive and unified student financial assistance system for tertiary education, UNIFAST, thereby rationalizing access thereto, appropriating funds therefore and for other purposes.
Mr. President, I move that this representation be recognized to sponsor the measure.
The acting majority leader, Senator Pia Cayetano, is recognized
Thank you.
to sponsor the measure.
Mr. President, esteemed colleagues, our Constitution in Article 14, Section 1 states, the state shall protect and promote the rights of all citizens to quality education at all levels and shall take appropriate steps to make such education accessible to all. However, it is a reality that many Filipinos are unable to reach, let alone complete, tertiary education because of financial constraints. The sad reality. The burden of the cost of tertiary education has resulted in low enrollment and completion rates among the poor and near poor. Unfortunately, the distribution of benefits and student financial assistance in state universities and colleges are not pro-poor. The combination of these two factors make quality tertiary education inaccessible to the majority of Filipino students. In fact, according to the Commission on Higher Education, its current STUFAP system serves about 60,000 students in 2011, or only about 2% of 2.7 million students, while there are hundreds of thousands of eligible students in need of financial assistance. In NCR alone, there is a big demand for financial assistance. However, out of 3,532 applicants of CHEDS to FAPS, only 309 or 8.75% receive full merit scholarships, while 422, 11.95% receive half merit scholarships, and 382, 10.82% receive grants in aid. Today, I stand before you to sponsor Committee Report number 110, the Unified Student Financial Assistance System for Tertiary Education, or the UNIFAST Bill. This proposed measure seeks to increase the enrollment and completion rate in tertiary education across all socioeconomic classes, especially the poor, by allocating and efficiently utilizing government resources under the UNIFAST. This bill shall harmonize, reform, strengthen, expand, rationalize, and refocus all the existing modalities of student financial assistance programs for tertiary education in both public and private institutions, whether nationally or locally funded. Creating the UNIFAST Board. Under the proposed measure, the various existing modalities of STUFAP shall be unified and harmonized to improve efficiency and promote equitable and rationalized access to quality tertiary education. Towards this end, the bill creates a UNIFAST board headed by CHED, which shall craft, approve, and review policies and strategies for providing STUFAP for tertiary education. The board shall also coordinate with all the implementing agencies of STUFAPs and shall lay down guidelines to ensure efficient generation and delivery of funding of these programs, as well as the faithful and effective implementation of policies to this end. Specifically, the UNIFAST board may adopt a qualifying examination system, if necessary, to aid in scoring and ranking applicants for scholarships, grants in aid, and student loans. The board shall also study the feasibility and sustainability of National Student Loan Program. Likewise, the bill also mandates the Secretariat of the UNIFAS Board to maintain and update a repository of data and information on all STUFAPs for tertiary education and tertiary education administered by any government agency, branch, or instrumentality. The Secretariat shall create and maintain a comprehensive database system on the government's STUFAP accessible to the public pursuant to the policy of transparency and good governance. Types of student financial assistance programs. Under this bill, STUFAP may be in the form of scholarships, grant-in-aid, student loans, socialized tuition fees, and other modalities that the UNIFAS Board, SUCs, and public tech VOC institutes may promulgate and develop. Scholarships are merit-based and require academic excellence or extraordinary talent regardless of economic status. A unified, improved, and rationalized government-funded scholarship program shall be instituted under this bill to encourage academic excellence among academically or technically capable students and enlarge the pool of world-class Filipino researchers, artists, innovators, and leaders. Scholarship shall cover at least the average cost of tertiary education of the top 40 public and private colleges and universities listed in the Registry of Programs and Institutions. Grants in aid are intended to improve equity and facilitate democratic access to education. Thus, they do not require academic excellence but a minimum level of competence to complete tertiary education. Grants shall likewise cover at least the average cost of tertiary education in the top 40 public and private colleges and universities listed in the Registry of Programs and Institutions. Student loans are extended to students facing liquidity problems regardless of economic status. However, the pilot initiative of the government experienced significant problems, such as difficulty in tracking and monitoring student borrowers after graduation, thus resulting in poor repayment collection. Further, beneficiaries are unable to pay due to high rates of unemployment or underemployment. Thus, the bill mandates the UNIFAS Board to study the feasibility and sustainability of a national student loan program, which shall provide for short-term and long-term financial assistance for tertiary education. This includes the development of efficient delivery, collection, and repayment mechanisms for student loans. Socialized tuition fee is a scheme that will be established by the Board to serve as a guide for SUCs and TVIs in implementing their own financial assistance programs. The socialized tuition fee scheme shall establish affordability brackets based on information about the applicant's personal circumstances, family income, family characteristics of the applicants, and socioeconomic characteristics of their households. Mr. President, the transformative potential of UNIFAS gears tertiary education reform towards greater student focus, greater equity and efficiency, and more access to quality tertiary education. This bill, which aims to reduce social and economic inequity, seeks to uphold our constitutional mandate to promote the right of all citizens to quality education at all levels. This measure will make tertiary education more accessible to our youth, and an investment in their education is an investment in the future of our nation. I thus earnestly seek for the swift passage of this bill. Thank you.
What is the pleasure of the Majority Leader?
Mr. President, I believe Senator Angara will also deliver a sponsorship speech next week. So on this note, I move that we suspend consideration of Bill 2679 under Committee Report 110.
Is there any objection? There being none, the consideration of Senate Bill number 2679 under Committee Report number 110 is hereby suspended.
2669, just for the record.
2669.
Yes. Mr. President, I believe there is no other matter for us to take up today. And on that note, I move that we adjourn the session until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Monday, March 9, 2015.
Is there any objection? There being none, the session is adjourned until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Monday, March 9, 2015.